Good morning from Sydney. It's breakfast time. What time is it? It's just coming up to 25 to 9 in the morning. I'm not going to say anything about Micah Richards stealing time from the TMS team, but here we are. And we're in Darling Harbour this morning. I'd love to say there's bright blue sky overhead and the sun pouring in, but actually it's a bit cloudy and there's a little bit of rain, and there's a few joggers just running around Darling Harbour past the really lovely looking yachts. I've got to say, this could be a day for choose which yacht you would have if you had infinite amounts of cash. And we're trying to stay positive. We're trying to stay positive in a cricketing sense about the fact that the fourth test starts tomorrow. So this time tomorrow we will be counting down to that fourth test, with England looking to restore some pride after losing the series, 3-0 down in the series. And between now and 10:30 we'll preview tomorrow's test. We'll hear from Joe Root and Steve Smith. Former England fast bowler Stephen Finn is with us. Hello, Finny. Very, very nice to have you back with the team.
Good
in
morning.
person.
I know it's nice to see some friendly faces. I've been dealing with Australians for the last couple of weeks by myself. So, some nice English faces. It's nice to see everyone.
Oh, well, it's great to have you back with the team. Simon Mann and Andy Zoltzman from the Test Match Special Team here as well. Hello, Simon.
Happy New Year, Eleanor.
Oh,
Happy
my
New
goodness,
Year.
You sound enthusiastic about the new year, which is great.
Uncharacteristically enthusiastic for you, Simon. Well done.
Simon's never happier than when the series is lost and there is doom and despondency.
That is so unfair. I've never heard anything more unfair.
Well, look, we are in Sydney. We're so lucky to be here. It's one of the great cities of the world. I had a little wander around yesterday, the Botanic Gardens, the Opera House. Actually went out to the Olympic Park. Zoltz being Zoltz, went to the Bradman Museum at Bowral, didn't you?
Yes, and the upshot of that is it turns out Don Bradman was very good at batting. That's very much the thrust of that museum.
Yes, spoiler alert. But I talked about building up to the Test match. Starting tomorrow, and us all being there, and the teams being there, and everything going ahead. I have to say, Simon, I'm kind of doing that with fingers crossed, because the situation at the moment with COVID in Sydney and across New South Wales is pretty bad. And we've had, obviously, Chris Silverwood is not there, as I think 4/7 of the coaching group are not with the team. There are no positive cases in the team, in either team, which is really good. But the chief executive of Cricket Australia, Nick Hockley, tested positive for COVID yesterday. So it's kind of one of those situations where you think, right, we're touching wood. There's a lot of wood to touch here.
Yeah, it feels a little bit as if we're trying to push a boulder up the hill to keep this Ashes series going, really. The bottom line is, and we've talked about this quite a bit this week on 5 Live, is the finances involved. It's worth an awful lot of money to Cricket Australia. The Ashes is worth a lot. The television broadcasting rights, so they have tried to keep the show on the road, basically. To give back 2/5 of the broadcasting money is a lot of money to give back to the broadcasters, so there is a will. We have seen other series that have been called off. India didn't play the 5th Test match at Old Trafford, for example. There have been other tours. England came home early from South Africa, a one-day tour, white ball tour, and they've got to go back there. So the idea is, how could you go back and play 2 more Ashes dead games? I mean, that would be really weird, like in a year's time. So you can sort of see the wheels of finance clicking, and why they want to keep things going. I hope it doesn't get a more uneven contest. You mentioned the players. Generally speaking, they've stayed free of it so far. Travis Head, of course, is just one player who has tested positive on the Australian side, but apart from that, no one else so far.
This must be so unsettling. I mean, Finny, you had the reason I'm saying you're welcome back to the team is that you had 10 days in a hotel room in Adelaide, having, come and been tested positive and come into contact. So we're really happy to have you back with us, and you've been okay.
Yes, I've been fine. I had a couple of dicey days at the beginning of my isolation, just with headaches and stuff, but I've been fine since, and nice to be out and feel slightly liberated, breathing fresh air again, which was a bit of a commodity in my hotel room in Adelaide. But yeah, it's good to be back out. But yeah, the situation here is obviously different to where I caught it. I caught it where it was almost impossible to catch it in Adelaide. I don't know how. A slightly more precarious situation here in Sydney, which I'd imagine all administrators and players will be very aware of.
And the fact that England are having to basically do their own training. I mean, people look at the England backroom staff and they say, why do they need all of these different coaches and different kinds of bowling coaches? And back in the day, they'd do it with, a team manager and a captain and a coach, and that was absolutely fine, sometimes without even a coach. But how difficult do you think this has been for them over the last week or so?
I don't think it would have been too difficult, because I think that when I look at that squad, I see a lot of good people who would be willing to help their friends out. And actually, in those situations as players, you do learn a little bit more about your teammates when you're practicing so acutely together, whereas when you have to just look after yourself, and the coaches are there to service you as a player, you sort of get your stuff done and then go into your own bubble, whereas this forces the players now having to throw balls to each other, having to help each other out, hit each other catches, catch the ball off the other's bowling and stuff like that. You actually learn a lot more about your teammates in those scenarios. So I think that they won't have found it overly difficult. They'll have to put in a lot more work, but also being 3-0 down in an Ashes series, if there's not a time more pertinent to put in more work, that I think now would be the time.
There was a poignant sight of Rory Burns with the dog thrower yesterday at the start of the net. He expected to bat first. The openers normally get first dibs, don't they, top order players. But from a distance, I spied him with the dog catcher at practice yesterday, throwing, I think, to Joe Root it was, out in the middle there, in the nets and in the SCG, and sort of an illustration of how his tour has not gone particularly well.
It is, but also he might be one of the only people competent with a dog flinger, because they're actually incredibly hard. If people don't know what we're talking about, they're literally the things that you pick up tennis balls with and ping them around the park for your dog. They've designed them for cricket balls, and it makes it easier on a coach's shoulder. But to learn how to throw one of them takes a lot of time. So like when I try, I either bowl halfway down the track or flat ones at the batter's head.
So you're firing beamers out of the dog stick.
Yeah. I'm preparing people for that Mark Wood ball in the first test match.
It's that nasty fast bowler in you, Finney.
Yeah, I know, but there's only a few people that are actually competent with them, so he might be one of the few who are. But yeah, it's slightly significant of his tour.
If there are any tensions among the group, then they're all going to be brought out now, aren't they?
Or if he fancies a game, you never know.
But it obviously has been a really, really tough build-up. And actually, Joe Root was talking to the media yesterday. We can have a little listen to what he had to say to Jonathan Agnew.
Well, it's obviously been challenging couple of weeks for us, and a challenging week in particular this last few days. We had a few things thrown at us, and we've just got to manage it as best as we can. Obviously, a depleted coaching group, challenges around the games as well as the games themselves, and we're trying to manage it as best we can. In terms of practice, it's obviously going to look very different. It looked very different yesterday. We've all just got to muck in. We've got to be good human beings, good professionals, help each other out where we can, and try and get the best possible prep going into these last two games. As I mentioned to you at the end of it, there's still a huge amount to play for. It's very disappointing that the Ashes are gone, but whether it be putting pride back into the badge, whether it be making sure that we get those Test Championship points, for individuals making sure that they're pushing hard to cement their spots in the team, there's a huge amount to play for this group of players. We've got to stay tight, we've got to stay together, and we've got to put in a performance on one of the great Test venues in world cricket.
Yeah, it must be an incredibly difficult tour to manage, isn't it? I mean, you've got, without putting words in your mouth, but I guess morale is pretty low. You've lost 3-0, you've got all this COVID stuff going on, testing almost non-stop. How are you keeping on top of all of that?
We're trying to manage it day by day, best as you can. I mean, you can only just try and be the best version of yourself every day. Throw yourself into the most important thing, which is trying to prepare well and put in performances out there. And as I say, we've got two opportunities here to do just that, to try and turn things around, take something away from this tour, and put in performances that an England Test team should do. So granted, it has been a challenge, and there have been things to deal with away from the games. But you guys have had to live through it as well for probably the first time throughout this pandemic, and you've seen firsthand how hard it can be and how difficult it can be. So it's part and parcel of the world we live in currently. Just got to manage it best we can.
There'll be some people here on the tour, there'll be some at home saying, just get on a plane and go home. How are you sort of nipping any of that sort of conversation in the bud?
Well, I mean, you've got to trust the medical advice. Those guys are put in place to keep us safe, keep us secure, and we'll if we feel safe and we want to be playing Test cricket, we want to make sure that we can get out there and as I say, we want to get something from this tour. We don't want to leave it 3-0. We want to try and make sure that we get 2 victories from these last 2 games. So as much as anything, we've got to try and shift our focus into our performance, try and do everything we can to keep ourselves safe, and concentrate on what we're qualified to do, not not worry what other people are qualified to do.
Sure. I mean, it seems amazing that no England players have tested positive, despite the other cases that you've had. Would it be, if there were an outbreak, if there were players testing positive, would you look at the future of the tour in a different way then?
I think that's something we've got to manage if it comes to fruition. I think, like I say, all we can do is throw ourselves into this game, and show that there's more to this team than that we've put out so far in this tour. I think that's the only approach that we can take, and we have to manage everything else day by day, and trust that as you've seen with no cases, it shows that we're living by the guidelines that have been set out, and that we're doing the right thing. So we just got to keep trusting that, doing everything we can to be diligent and keep everyone and the game safe.
I read a report somewhere the other day saying that you've had a chat with some senior players, and you said that you want to carry on as England captain after this. Is that correct? Is that how you feel?
I need to make sure that my full focus is on these 2 games first and foremost. I need to try and, as I mentioned, get the best out of the group, make sure we put in those performances, keep banging on about out there on the field, and we'll worry about any of that at the end of the series. But I've got 2 big games here to manage well, and then the future we'll look at the end of this tour.
And could those 2 games make a difference? I mean, to all sorts of things. I know the Ashes has gone, but I mean, as far as your future's concerned, the coach's future's concerned, the whole way this tour might be remembered, does a lot hinge on these last 2 games, do you think? Could it change opinions of how this tour has gone?
It could, but again, I can't control other people's opinions. All I can try and control is being as ready as we can be for this next game, trying to influence the group as best I can to put in a performance which has been better than the previous 3. And that's all we can really control right now. We want to, as I say, we want to give people back home something to shout about, to show that how much we care about this team and how much we care about Test cricket, and how desperate we are to do well. And as I say, to win out here would be these last 2 games would be a really big step forward from especially off the back of the first 3 games of this series.
Yeah, sure. Now, I guess what I'm saying is would your decisions about the future possibly hinge on these 2 games? I mean, would you look at the future differently if you actually come off the back of this tour with 2 good wins?
As I say, I'll look at the future at the end of this tour. I don't think I can afford to throw any more energy into anything else than the games themselves right now. With everything else that's going on around the Test matches, there's enough distractions. Don't need the team or me to be thinking elsewhere. We need to make sure that we're fully focused on the job in hand in these 2 games.
What are your memories of this place? I mean,
mixed, a little bit mixed.
Yeah.
Last time I remember, I think it was on a drip for.
Yes. It's not really quite as hot, I don't think.
It doesn't look that way, but there's a few mixed memories. I've played a number of different games here one day, and obviously the Test matches here. So hopefully it'd be good to leave here with some better memories.
Grass too. I'm not sure many of the games you'd have played on have had that much grass on before.
No, and like a few of the surfaces that we've come across so far out here, they've looked pretty different to previous tours and previous Test matches that we've played here. So it's about managing the conditions well, isn't it? Whatever surface is put in front of you, you've got to manage them well. And so far, Australia have done that better than us. This is another opportunity for us to get that right, get the right side of that, and show a better version of ourselves as a team.
Well, that was Joe Root talking to Jonathan Agnew here in Sydney, where the sun came out briefly here in Darling Harbour. We're overlooking, as I say, the lovely yachts. There's a fountain down below. If you can hear the sound of running water in the background, there's a little fountain with some unidentified birds. I think there's storks or cranes or something like that. How are you on ornithology, Finny?
Not great. I thought they were real birds, and then I looked down, and
Yes, no.
they're not.
No, they're silver birds. This is boding well for your eyesight for the Test match coming up. Joe Root, the fact that he is obviously going to be asked questions about his captaincy all the time from this point onwards. What do you think he will do? You know him better than any of us sitting around this table.
Well, I see a very determined man as an England captain and as a player. He's dealt with adversity, I think, along the way. Had to try and shape and mould this team after having Alistair Cook as captain. I think I can't see him not carrying on. I think one, because he'll be determined to not leave on this note. And I certainly don't think he'll walk away of his own accord. And then, second of all, I don't really see another definite alternative that's going to play every single test match, as someone who would want to do it first and foremost, and then someone who would be more competent than him. So for those two reasons, I would say I'd be surprised if he weren't to carry on.
It's a really interesting situation, an odd situation, unique situation really. You've got a captain that basically hasn't won 3 Ashes series, and normally for an England captain it's unthinkable that they would carry on. And also, he's done the job for a long time now. He's going to make his 60th appearance as England captain tomorrow, which is a record. There's a certain sort of shelf life in a job of England captain. And you think it's inevitable that he's got to sort of come to an end. But actually, it's funny. Actually, you feel, well, there's no obvious alternative. I mean, Ben Stokes possibly, but there are one or two things that would have to be worked out there, and he's had a big strain this year, of course. So what do England do? I mean, it's sort of, we are in a limbo situation in these last 2 test matches. So Joe will be knowing what he's obviously been thinking a lot about it in his hotel room at night, thinking what am I going to do? Normally England captains stand down at the end of an Ashes series and Ashes defeat, but in this situation you just wonder whether he might well carry on. Of course, they might take it out of his hand and say enough is enough, we haven't had enough success, but but where do they turn?
So it'd be unlikely that he would jump, but he might potentially get pushed. But at the same time, as you say, they're not going to push him if there isn't an obvious person to take over.
Also, the other thing as well is who is making the decisions at the top. Tom Harrison, there's no chairman of the ECB at the moment. What about Chris Silverwood's position? What about Ashley Giles's situation? And they'll have to sort it out pretty quickly, because bizarrely England got another tour coming up fairly soon to the Caribbean in March.
Yeah. Just a word about his figures, Andy, because this is his 60th test match, so he overtakes Alistair Cook in this test.
Yeah, so the most tests anyone has captained England in. Roots had 27 wins, 24 losses and 8 draws. After that spectacular win in the first test in India, he had 26 wins and 15 draws, which gave him quite a healthy win-loss ratio. Out of 18 captains who've captained England 20 or more times, he was 8th. Since then, England have won 1 and lost 9 and drawn 2, and he's dropped down to 12th out of 18 there. And if you look at how those results break down, against the top 3 teams, against Australia, 1-2, lost 9. Against New Zealand, hasn't won a game, lost 3, drawn 3, couple of draws against Australia. Against England, against India, 1-6, lost 6. But that started with a 4-1 win at home in 2018, so recently that's sort of swung against them. Against all the other teams, the lower ranked teams in the world rankings, the World Test Championship, won 19, lost 6. So I mean, it's hard to, it's been always hard through cricket history to quantify the impact of a captain. And you look at Root's results, England under him have tended to beat the sort of, relatively weaker sides and struggle against the stronger sides.
How good is he as a captain, Simon, do you think?
Well, I mean, there are times when you wonder. I mean, there are so many different aspects to captaincy, aren't there? There's in the dressing room with the players and getting your message across to the players and keeping your players together as a group, and then there's the tactics out on the field. I mean, there was one passage of play which I didn't particularly like in the last Test match after lunch when Australia were about 110 for 4, something like that. And that was the moment to try to grasp the game, and he bowled Jack Leach round the wicket to the left-handers and leg stump with 4 men on the leg side boundary, and I thought that was a really strange piece of captaincy. But he does seem to have the support of his teammates. But do you need more than that? I mean, it's not a great CV to continue. I mean, the stats that Zolt's read out there. So in normal circumstances, you'd say it's got to be the end, but is it going to be? I mean, that's a big question to be answered.
Yeah, I mean, and I completely agree. I just think that there's more infrastructural problems in England cricket at the moment.
It's not as simple as just the captain.
No,
is it?
because I think a lot more rests on other people's head, because as a captain you need to be supported and helped and guided through these situations, and that comes from discussions within the dressing room, from between the coach and the captain, and then above that, it just doesn't seem as though, like, in trying to make it a more clear, direct line of communication from Ashley Giles to Chris Silverwood to Joe Root, I feel like it's become very muddled with the lack of a head selector being able to take accountability for that, and then a coach and captain being able to take accountability for the decisions on the field. And I think that with the structure as it is at the moment, it just leaves too much for one person to do in Chris Silverwood with that job, I think.
Results.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very hard to successfully captain a team that has only one functioning batsman, essentially, which is the situation England have been in.
Which is himself.
Yes, for the last years. We've talked about those stats with numbing regularity as he's got further and further ahead of the rest of the England team. He scored more than England's next 3 run scorers combined in 2021. So I remember something Richie Beno often said on commentary, and he was one of the great captains of Test cricket, so that captaincy is 90% luck and 10% skill, but don't try it without the 10%. But in terms of the 90% luck, in terms of the composition of this England team, Root's been unlucky. They just don't have the batting at the moment. And we look back to Mike Brearley as one of England's great captains. He came here in 1978-79. England won the Ashes 5-1 against a much weakened Australia during the Packer crisis, and most of their top players, it was almost like a second and a half, third string Australian team. The following winter they came back for a non-Ashes tour against Australia with all those players restored and lost 3-0. So, I mean, what does that show you about Brearley's captaincy? Probably not a lot, but it does show you that captaincy can only have so much effect.
One of the remarkable things about Joe Root and his captaincy is that normally it wears you down, but Root has just had an incredibly successful year, which is actually sort of remarkable, really, that he's been able to hold England together and just score so many runs. I mean, it is an incredible stat, that.
Yes, and for much of his captaincy, his batting was significantly declined on the stellar figures he had early in his career, in the sort of 3 or 4 years before he became captain, when he was grouped with Coley, Williams and Smith in that absolute top bracket, and he had declined over 2 or 3 years, really. Had a long period without first inning centuries, and that's so it did seem that the captaincy had, I think, affected his batting form, but over the last 12 months he's got sort of flipped completely the other way and been batted as well as he's ever played.
Yeah, he's just, I think, the sign of what a great player he is, and some people would argue that the captaincy made his batting decline in those times, but he's shown signs of coming out the other side, and I do think you're right about the luck element of it, because you look at the team that we beat down here in 2010-11, and that's probably the strongest cricket team that I've ever played in, but we came into playing against an Australian team in close to turmoil, where Ricky Ponting hadn't scored runs, Mitchell Johnson wasn't the force that he was 3 years later. There were Doug Bollinger, Ben Hilfenhaus, great bowler, or good bowlers, but not a Hazelwood, Stark, Cummins, Lyon, and Australia's spinner was Xavier Doherty for the first 2 Test matches, and then Michael Beer for the last 3, who've never really been seen again. So it is very much about luck and the situation and the circumstances, and unfortunately for Joe Root, with the side that he's come up against in Australia. And I know actually people have talked a fair bit about the teams being even coming into the series. I mean, I don't see it like that at all. Australia have 3 batters who average over 50 in Test match cricket in their top 6. They've got guys who are domestically in form coming into this series. You've got 3 of the finest fast bowlers to have played the game in the last 5 years.
One of whom has been injured since the first Test.
Yeah, absolutely, and they've been replaced by actually quite canny selections for the conditions. And an off-spinner who's took 400 wickets, and I know we talk about him as just being an off-spinner, but he's took 400 Test wickets in predominantly Australian conditions, where no one as a finger spinner has taken that many wickets or been as successful.
There's been quite a bit of comment about this is not a very good Australian side, or not that good an Australian side. I mean, there's some. It's pretty good. I mean, it's not perfect. It's not like the teams that we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s, but there's some decent players in that side, and in their conditions, not easy to come here and do well.
And their bowling attack is sort of perfectly balanced. They have the left arm pace, the spinners, Finney was saying, and then 2 different right arm seamers. That's something I think England have lacked in this series, that variety of speeds, trajectories, to challenge the batsmen in different ways.
The 5 Live Cricket Show.
And good evening and welcome back to Sydney, where it's breakfast time and we are overlooking Darling Harbour, sitting at a little cafe table with a fountain just playing below us, and at the smart hotels all around the waterside and the sleek yachts and a giant Australian flag just taunting us because Australia are 3-0 up in the Ashes series. But the fourth test starts tomorrow and England haven't won a test match in Australia since the test match that you played in, the series that you played in, Finney, because you didn't play that test match, but in 2010-11. I mean, that is an extraordinary thing. So it is 11 years since England won a test match in Australia. Why did we even have hope at the start of the series? History is against us.
2 pink ball games we were championing, weren't we? And that was probably the worst defeat of the lot. So it's not been ideal for us or England, has it? But it's the disparity in conditions, I think. You come here and it's just so different to the UK, and so much harder to adapt. You throw into, on top of that, the fact that the preparation was poor. It was less than poor, it was shambolic. And then throw into that COVID and the biosecure bubbles that the guys have been in for the last 2 years. I think you throw everything into the melting pot, and it's a shame and it's sad and it's disappointing, but it's not all that surprising.
Yeah, and you can throw in the fact that England are not a very good side as well. I mean, there's that bottom line, and the signs were there earlier this year, losing at home to New Zealand, who are a pretty decent side, obviously, and losing heavily in India, and then 2-1 down against India as well. And those two teams exposed England's deficiencies in the summer, so it's no great surprise when you come here to Australia and talk about the disparity in conditions that Finney was there, that England were going to find it tough in this series. They haven't helped themselves, but there have been things against them, and their general inability to sort of reach that top level that those 3 teams I mentioned, Australia, New Zealand and India, have been able to reach, is against them as well.
Yeah, which I guess sort of plays into that thing we were talking about before with Root's captaincy of beating the teams England are ranked above and losing to the ones that they're ranked below. They played Sri Lanka at the start of the year, played really well, but it was a Sri Lanka team without their 2 best batters, Karuna Ratne and Dhananjaya De Silva, who were both out injured. So yeah, it's been a really tough 13 consecutive tests without a win in Australia. That's England's longest winless run in Australia. Some solace, or at least some focus, could come from the previous run. They beat 12 games from the 3rd test of the 36-7 series up to the 5th test that they won in 1951, the end of the 50-51 series. They were 4-0 down. They won the 5th test, having been quite competitive in that series, which England haven't been in this one really. But that then went on to win the next 3 series, and after the war, England had really struggled against Australia. That win slightly changed that momentum. And I think for the team collectively, with another tough year coming up, New Zealand at home, South Africa have got a really strong bowling attack coming together, then it's really important, I think, to get something out of these games, and for the individual players who no one's on the honours board yet, Ellie. There's never, since 1886, a 3-game series in England when Australia had no centuries and no fifers. There hasn't been an Ashes series in which a team did not get someone with a fifer or a century. So let's have a thing to celebrate.
Yeah. And how important is that, Finney? I mean, it's easy. So sorry, I'm kind of talking as if anybody who's just tuned in during the news. Andy Zaltzman, Simon Mann, Stephen Finn, all with me, sitting in Sydney, looking forward to our breakfast. But how important is it, Finney, to get something out of these last 2 test matches, even if it's a draw? That we do not want that 5-0 feeling again. Well,
there are careers and reputations on the line. I think it's as simple as that, and you know that when you're in this situation as a player, and there'll be guys in that dressing room who know that their heads will be on the chopping block regardless of what happens in these last 2 test matches. But you can go a long way to giving yourself some more time or another opportunity by doing well in these next 2 test matches. And there is going to be bloodshed at the end of this tour. That 100% will be. I mean, Simon's grinning at me at the thought of bloodshed, but there will be. There will be at the end of this tour, in some regard. There will be changes, because Ashes series always signify changes. So you need to make sure it's not you on the chopping block.
Absolutely. You talk about reputations on the line as well. And Stuart Broad, in his column for the Daily Mail this week, was talking about his absolute frustration because, of course, Broad and Anderson are arguably England's greatest fast bowling pair. It's certainly bowling in tandem, certainly in terms of wicket taking as well. 1,100 wickets between them. but for those two, Simon, to not finish this tour with a 5-0 behind them, they must be so desperate for that.
You just sense Stuart Broad's frustration as well in his newspaper column in the Mail. The fact that he's seen two really green pitches at Brisbane and Melbourne. He's not played in either of them, and you saw the pitch at Adelaide, which was much drier and browner, and he did play there and bowled. He bowled okay. So you can understand that frustration. He's come to Australia and seen Steve Smith batting at the other end on shirt fronts and thinking, I wanted a bowl at Brisbane, I wanted a bowl at Melbourne, and he wasn't given the opportunity. So you can understand his frustration. In terms of, I wasn't sort of smiling at the thought of bloodshed. It was more the image that you conjured up, Stephen. But I mean, it'd be a brave person that could predict England's team for the first test against the West Indies in their tour in March, because you feel there might be lots of changes. There might be hardly any. I mean, there are not going to be many changes. I don't think there's going to be many changes for this Test match. I think it's the top 7 looks as though it's going to be the same as played in Melbourne, despite the 68 all out. I was watching the slip cordon yesterday, how they were all lined up, and you just piece it all together. You think, looks like the same top 7.
Yeah. But well, it's interesting is what you say about Brisbane and Melbourne, because Steve Smith was talking yesterday to the press, and he said he was really amazed that he didn't play in either of those games.
Yeah, we have been a bit surprised. Probably 2 wickets that would have suited him pretty well. So, yeah, he's bowled well in Adelaide. He's always been a good contest for me. He's got me out quite a few times. I've scored some runs off him, so it's been, I think, a decent battle. So, they've got quality bowlers. Him and Jimmy together, obviously, 2 world-class performers, have been for a long time. So, maybe we'll see them together out here this week. Not sure, but we'll continue to hopefully play the way we are and keep moving forward and have a successful week.
Well, that was Steve Smith talking about Stuart Broad. Steve Smith also said yesterday in his media commitments that he's hungry for a century because he hasn't had a really big score in this series yet. So all the Aussie TV networks are saying Steve Smith puts England on notice that he's got runs in him. So we shall see. Look, and I think a final word about this Test match starting tomorrow is that Stuart Broad, we do expect that he will probably return. But in place of Ollie Robinson, which is kind of an interesting call, Simon.
Yeah, well, Robinson's England's leading wicket taker in the series. You can imagine the Australian media saying, England, what have England done? They've just dropped their leading wicket taker, but he has played all 3 matches, and so there's been a sort of rotation policy. Well, 2 other things I should say. Pitch looks quite green, but that's sort of 2 days out. And also the weather in Sydney. The weather's broken here. We've had some rain today, and the forecast is for rain during the game. So, mind you, England lost in 2 days in a session in the last game. So, they might have time to fit the match in. But I think we might be battling the elements a little bit in the next few days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we hope that it maybe extend the Test match a bit longer. So our friend Glenn, Glenn McGrath can be here because, of course, this is the Pink Test in memory and raising a lot of money. I mean, they raised millions of dollars last year in the Pink Ball Test, even without a crowd, in the Pink Test. For the McGrath Foundation. But look, we want to talk about something which it's been a bit of a theme through the series. We've tried to kind of take you down memory lane, give you a bit of history of where we are, of the ground that we're at, some of the great things that have happened. And Andy Zaltzman, when you went to the Bradman Museum yesterday, you bought another book. You bought so many books in this trip.
Yes. It's a sort of pictorial history of the SCG, and the front cover's a picture from 1901, and a couple of the old stands are still there. I think it was what's called the Ladies' Pavilion and the Members' Pavilion, is that right? Much of the rest of it rather different now. It's a kind of giant concrete bowl apart from that, but it still has that sort of link to the past that the MCG has totally lost, and it's obviously a historic ground in Anglo-Australian cricket history. They've been playing tests since 1882 at the SCG. There have been some classic games. England won, having followed on in 1894 with a couple of very hungover spinners when it rained before the last day, spinning them to a 10-run victory. So there's been some wonderful scenes at the SCG over the years. Slightly fewer in recent years for England, but their record there is pretty good. They've won 22 tests. They're the most any team has won at an away ground. I think they've won more tests. I'm just trying to find my stat. They've won more tests at the SCG than they have at Edge. They've played more at the SCG than they've played at Edgbaston. But yeah, they've had quite a lot of wins there. Many of them in the mists of history.
Yeah, there are lots of lovely statues as well, and there's that real sense as well when you go inside the ground. The precincts are very well laid out. You've got a statue of Richie Benno, there's a statue of Bradman, of course, and there's a statue of Bradman I think at every single Australian cricket ground probably. But Simon, what are your memories of going to the SCG?
Well, the first Test match I saw here was in 94-5, and it was a remarkable game of cricket, not least because Michael Atherton declared on Graham Hick on 98 not out, and I remember being on the hill with a few BBC colleagues who were actually just out here on holiday, and we were just chatting away, and the declaration's imminent, and suddenly there was Atherton declaring on Graham Hick 98 not out. He gave him the over. He did put him on notice. We're going to be declaring at the end of the over, and he blocked a couple of balls, and he thought this is odd tactics. Is he going to give him another over? No. And I've had a look back at this, and basically England had to declare when they did to get a go at Australia before tea. If they'd gone for another over and then they declared, then the umpires would have called tees. They wanted a bit before tea and a bit afterwards. So you could totally understand Mike Atherton's logic there, although he does say, and he said the other day in an event I was doing, he did say that it's one of the things he really regrets, because what happened was they went back to the dressing room, and it sort of split the dressing room, really. I mean, it's Graham Hick, was really unhappy in the dressing room. Other players thought that sided with Hick, and some players sided with Atherton. So when they went out, Australia needed 449, something like that, to win the game, and Slater and Taylor put on 200 for the first wicket. The spirits were low, and you think, hold on, we got 450 in the bank, we should be on a high, but they went out on a bit of a low, but they still nearly won the game. It was an amazing game of cricket. It was also the game in which the umpires called time on the last day, because it rained on the last day. The umpires called time. Then Mike Atherton looked at his watch and thought, we haven't had an hour's cricket in this last hour. And they took the covers off and went back and played another over or two. It was a bizarre game of cricket. But
what are your memories of the SCG?
I've only really I have only played one-day internationals there. I've not played Test matches. I was there obviously for the 10-11 Test match, but carrying the drinks. I've got sort of mixed memories of the place, because that was such a euphoric time to be there in 2010-11, celebrating with the Barmy Army in that far stand, and going over there and being able to, or in the days when you were allowed to go and mingle with the crowd, and there's like a great photo of the entire team in front of the Barmy Army and everyone celebrating. That was my first ever memory of the SCG, and then you think this place is amazing, and the dressing rooms they're really hard to describe, but they're the oldest looking dressing rooms that I've ever changed in ever, and that's including club cricket. It's like you'd go in there and you'd think, well, Langlebury third 11 wouldn't change in this. Like, well, what is going on here? And everything's wooden with it's like big wooden bays in the dressing room, and there's like old players' signatures on the space. So you go into the dressing room and you can see previous players that have sat in that spot because they've signed the wooden slats in the dressing room. So, and I remember distinctly Cook, Swan, Anderson, Pryor all signed their spots in the dressing room when we won that Ashes test in 2010-11. So it was a nice memento. I hope no one's painted over it. I haven't been in there for 6 or 7 or 5 or 6 years now since the World Cup. But then also I remember really badly rolling my ankle whilst bowling. When my back foot landed to bowl, it sort of slid from underneath me and I sort of slid down the wicket. And I remember being quite embarrassed, and then had to go down to the stand on the down in front of not the members stand, it's the far right hand corner of the ground. I can't remember the name of the stand, but the entire stand were singing a song at me, which includes some unpleasant phrases, but the entire stand was singing give me an F, and the entire stand would say F, give me an I, give me an N, give me an N, what does that spell? And then a 4-letter expletive. So it was it wasn't the happiest moment of my England career down there, having been slapped about by Australia and then having to deal with that.
There have been some incredible feats as well. I mean, individual feats. Steve Waugh. People talk about Steve Waugh's century, where he reached his century off the very final ball of the day. Andy, I mean that was. Even as an England fan, you've got to appreciate the achievement there.
Well, yes, it was certainly a dramatic moment. He was out, I think, very early the following day, and England actually went on to win that game. That was the final test of the 02-03 series, when England were, any guesses anyone, 4-0 down after 4. Andy Caddick in his final test took 7 wickets in the second innings to bowl England to victory, 10 in the match. Michael Vaughan scored the third of his centuries in that series, 183. So that was, again, that was a dead rubber win. England went on to win the next Ashes. Let's cling to that. There'd be some other great moments for England. I mean, you go right back to the early days of Test cricket. I found this game that looks like an absolute classic. 1886-7. England won by 13 runs, with a wicket-keeper called Mordecai Sherwin, the only Mordecai to play Test cricket, as far as I know. And I was reading on his Wikipedia page that the Sher bit of his name was used by Conan Doyle in naming Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle, a massive cricket fan, used to take cricketers' names and name his characters after them. According to Bill Frindle, he was the heaviest Test wicket-keeper of all time at 17 stone. So different days. They won. Billy Barnes was the hero with the ball. He missed the second Test that series after trying to punch the Australian captain Percy McDonnell, missing and breaking his hand on a wall. So a bit of an issue in an 11-man touring party in those days. So, some great moments. 1970-71. Series that we talked about a bit with Ian Chappell, who took over Australian captaincy for the final test of that series. England were 1-0 up. Australia held the Ashes, so England needed a win or a draw. Very close fought game at the SCG, and Finney talks about the relative strength of Australia in that 2010-11 series, however good England were. In that deciding test of the Ashes, Australia's bowling attack had 3 Test caps between them. Their 4 frontline bowlers. They had 3 guys in their second test, 1 guy on debut, and it was a very low-scoring game. And England bowled Australia out when they were chasing 2-2-3 for 160 to win the Ashes. Ray Illingworth passed away recently. Captain England took 3 key second innings wickets. So there have been great moments, and talk about great innings. One of England's greatest, 1903-4, Tip Foster on Test debut, 287, batting at number 5 in another great England win.
Just going back to 2010-11, a couple of things stick in my mind about that game. Obviously, the Mitchell Johnson walking out to bat, and you were talking about the abuse you were getting from the fans at the SCG. I remember the Barmy Army up on the old hill there. It's now the Victor Trumper stand. Giving him the Mitchell Johnson song on the way out, and then he was cleaned up by Tremlett and giving him the Mitchell Johnson song. I won't do the song because I probably we're past the watershed, but even though
he bowls to the left, he bowls to the right, etc.
Although he put that right, didn't he? 4 years later, your bowling's pretty good, actually. I think it was the line at the end.
They didn't update the song, though, did they?
I don't think so. They should have done anyway. But I also remember how times changed. I remember Usman Khawaja making his debut in that Test match, and I remember he made 37, and he was the lead story in the local newspaper the next day, because it was actually something to cling on to. This new player, he'd made 37 against England. How times have changed.
It seems like the most glorious anomaly, doesn't it, really, that series, that Test match, that feeling. I mean, we saw the Australians at the MCG last week sitting around on the outfield, the players bringing their families along, the David Warner's kids running up and down the wicket, and actually giving a bit more wear to the pitch that hadn't had much wear over the previous 2 and a bit days. Finny, but what did it feel like sitting on the outfield that day at the SCG?
Well, it was phenomenal. I mean, and then I'll talk about it in a second, but my experience 4 years later was very, very different sat there. But in 10-11, when I was just so naive to it, I think, at the time, because I just thought that's what happened. You go away, you beat Australia. It's great, but I hadn't lost a Test series at that stage. You just sort of just keep rolling on with the punches at the time. So at the end of the series, the guys who'd played there before and played in 06-07, where we got drilled, they were saying, this is a phenomenally special moment. Make sure you savour it. Make sure you make it last. So we went out there and sat in a circle on the wicket. Everyone got a couple of beers, and you just sat there and you went around the circle, and everyone said what their special memory of the tour was and what it meant to them, and the team and your teammates, and then everyone would have a drink after each person told their story, and everyone in the playing group and the coaching staff joined in and said something. And it was just a really special moment that you just sat there and gave you something to savour and cling on to. And even though I didn't play in those final 2 test matches, and I was really sad and disappointed that I wasn't playing at the time, and at the time you're sad, you're embarrassed because you've been dropped, and you sort of have these emotions that you don't really know how to deal with. But at the end of that week in Sydney, the overriding thought was just, wow, this is just really special and amazing, with what was it turned out to be probably the best cricket team that I ever played in.
We should talk about Darren Gough as well, Simon, because that was, again, in a losing Ashes series, but a Gough hat-trick at the SCG. Just remind us of that.
Yeah, well, it was a brilliant performance, to help England win a test match. And in those days, it was consolation victories. I mean, the difference with Finney's tour was that England won matches that really mattered. I mean, you can argue all Ashes test matches matter, but to win a sort of consolation game, Darren Gough, superb. He'd actually been superb. He sort of burst onto the scene 4 years before that, actually, in the SCG test match, when he made a half century in 56 balls, and then took 6 for 49 as Australia were bowled out for 116. That sounds nice, doesn't it? 116 all out, Australia. And there was something. There's something about, you sensed. It was early in his career. You sensed he had something about him.
Well, you might be conflating 2 tests. They lost the game. He took the hat-trick in at Sydney. He took the last 2 wickets at Melbourne in 98-9. But in the context of Anglo-Australian cricket in Australia in the last 30 years, I think taking a hat-trick for England counts as a test win. So we'll cling to that.
And so for you, Simon, the memory. I mean, what's your overriding memory? What do you think about when you think about cricket at the SCG?
Well, the most recent memory is watching the Marsh Brothers put on about 500. No, those things that stand out. Yeah, that test match in 94-5, your first ever visit to the ground. The 2010-11, Aggers made to do the sprinkler at the end. There was a great line in Ali Martin's piece in The Guardian the other day after England's capitulation in Melbourne. The first line in his piece was, Ali Martin writes to The Guardian, he said, 11 years on from the sprinkler came the shower. So I thought it was a wonderful first line to sort of sum up what happened in Melbourne. 2010-11 will always stay in the memory, but last time was reality. Australia 647 for 9 declared, and Mason Crane in that game won for 193.
And Joe Root, actually, as he mentioned in the interview, ending up on a drip in hospital, having just completely. So he was not there effectively. The end of the Ashes were lost, and Joe Root wiped out completely.
Well, because
he was. For heat exhaustion.
Yeah. Well, I missed the end of the Ashes in the 13-14 Ashes series, because it finished really quickly on the last day of that test match, and I was 12th man, and each day of the test, 2 of the 12th men are given the day off to just go and do what you want, so you can get away from the environment and get away from having to carry drinks and train the entire time. And the day that the Ashes finished in 2013-14 was my day off. So I'd gone to a remote beach, and was just sat there contemplating life and relaxing, and no reception. So I was there for a few hours on the beach, and I was like, I better go up and check my phone and see what's happening in the cricket. Well, it went up these steps and got to some degree of civilization. Checked my phone, and there was messages from the manager, Phil Neal, saying, "Get back to the ground. You need to be here." I was like, "Why on earth would I need to be there?" Looked at the scores. We'd been bowled out, I think it was, on that last day. So I had to go back to the hotel, get my England training kit, because I was in beach shorts and a t-shirt. Had to get a taxi to the ground.
This is top level professional sport, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. I had to, and this is the end of the shambolic tour as well. So I had to then get a taxi to the ground. Then, because I couldn't get close to the ground because people were either leaving or they're in there celebrating, it was all cordoned off. I had to, in my England kit, sprint to the ground to try and make it for the presentation. Missed the presentation, and then just walked straight into the post-series beer with the Australians, which is actually one of my favourite things and favourite memories of the Sydney Test matches, both good in 2010-11 and bad in 13-14, is going into the Australian dressing room and sitting around and just chatting to people. And I had a really really enlightening conversation with Mitchell Johnson in the 13-14 Ashes series there, where he'd obviously had the struggles of 10-11, then came back and did incredibly well in 13-14. And 13-14 is the series where I got sent home for being, as Ashley Darge described, unselectable at the end of that tour. And I sat down with Mitchell Johnson for about an hour and a half and just chatted about what he did to sort of back up his system to get back to being the amazing bowler that he was in 13-14. And that's one of my biggest motivating things to come back from that experience to play for England again, was that conversation in the Sydney dressing room over a beer with Mitchell Johnson. So even though I've good and bad memories of that place, I think that would probably be my favourite memory, even though it came in a pretty sad and dark time.
It's always quite a strange thing to discover that these fearsome Australian bowlers, Mitchell Johnson and Glenn McGrath being two of them, are actually really nice. Mitchell Johnson worked with us in 2019, and he was a top bloke. Well, I think that might be our last Ashes Tour Tales of the series, because when it comes to Hobart, there are no Ashes Tour Tales, because there's never been an Ashes Test at Hobart. Very briefly before we hand to Colin, thoughts about what England need to do tomorrow at the SCG, particularly, Simon. Should Joe Root win the toss? What do you think?
Well, if it's green and it's overcast, bowl. I just do something that's fairly straightforward. Just have a go, see whether you can get into Australia's top order. I think that's what I would say. Yeah, go for it.
Nothing to lose, really, is there, Zoltz, at this stage?
I'd agree. I think it's a similar decision to Brisbane, particularly if there's some weather around. I think bowling first gives them the best chance of winning and the best chance of not losing. It pits England's stronger suit against Australia's relatively weaker suit.
Yep, completely agree. I think just do something different. You're at the stage of the tour now where you throw caution to the wind and you take a gamble and a risk. You go against the statistics and you see what is in front of you and you make a decision based on that, which maybe England haven't done over the course of this Test series.